I asked 348 fantasy readers the number one thing they hate to read, and I'm about to share with you the 10 most common responses, along with sharing some thoughts and advice on how you can avoid this in your own writing based on my experience of having written 4 fantasy books and a video game, so that you can be learning from this data to write better fantasy stories yourself. We had over 10,000 words worth of responses for this entire survey, and some of the answers really surprised me. As we go through them, you'll learn which of these 10 things I personally dislike the most, along with a few instances where I actually disagree with the answers provided in the survey. Let's start with number 10, modern language and anachronistic terms. A lot of readers say that they're pulled out of the immersive experience of reading a fantasy story when they come across phrases or saying or slang that doesn't quite fit with the world's time period or setting. For example, this response from the survey said, "I don't like when modern sayings or words are used if the fantasy has a medieval/Renaissance, etc. setting. Words like okay, what's up, take me right out of the immersion. Not saying dialogues and narration must be super ancient sounding or complicated, but I prefer it when neutral or period appropriate terms are used. Anachronistic elements, ideas, and speech, including internal thoughts that don't mesh with the story's established setting, such as the environment, the history, the technology, culture, etc., or tone." I totally agree with this. Whenever I'm editing fantasy stories for my clients, I always pick this stuff up because it's really shattering to the reader's suspension of disbelief to come across something that feels like modern American slang when they're reading a story that's meant to be set back in the 1200s or the 1300s or whenever the sort of technological period of your story is supposed to be. And I would also encourage you as a writer to not just think about anachronistic terms coming up in dialogue with slang and sayings, but also in the similes and the metaphors and the figures of speech that you use throughout your story as well, both within dialogue and also just within description. For example, if your story is set on a space colony that has none of Earth's flora, then don't describe people as being busy as a bee, because there's probably no flowers for the bees to pollinate in that setting. Likewise, if you have a fantasy story that follows a desert-dwelling tribe, it might not make sense to use the phrase, "This person looked awkward like a fish out of water," because that tribe probably doesn't have a ton to do with fishing and it wouldn't really work its way into their vocabulary. Number 9, slow pacing and filler content. Readers really dislike plot lines that don't feel like they progress or advance the story. So we had one response here saying, "I hate it when the characters don't try to make any progress. Them trying and failing to make progress towards their goal, that's fine. But having them not actively trying to accomplish their mission for chapters on end makes reading it so tedious and boring. Slow transitions between events such as transit or setting up/preparing to do the actually interesting thing, such as organizing things, gathering, traveling, at least if it's unessential to the main plot, yet highly detailed. These are all things that readers really don't appreciate." And we've got another comment here about filler plot lines that are irrelevant to the actual story as a whole. So my thoughts on this are how fast or how slow your story feels has nothing to do with the word count or the page count, and everything to do with the sense of progress the reader is experiencing. As long as something changes in a meaningful way from the start to finish of each chapter you write, readers are going to feel like there is advancement and forward momentum in the story. And as a result, you're probably going to avoid any major pacing issues. Of course, you do need to make sure that that advancement and that sense of progress relates to the central spine and the central premise of your story so that it doesn't feel like a pointless diversion. It's also really important to vary your scene formats. Here's a big diagram of lots of different scene formats you can use in your writing. But the problem is that many times when I'm editing a fantasy story for a writer, I see the same scene formats used over and over again. For example, you might have 2 characters talking in a room, then they go into a different room and they talk some more. Then they go back into that first room and now there's a few other characters with them and they're all talking again. It's the same scene format repeated over and over again. If on the other hand you have your characters talking in a room and then they need to sneak into a palace to try to steal an item and they have to solve all these clues and these puzzles to kind of get that item out of the safe, and then they're arguing with each other while they're fleeing the guards across the rooftops of the city as they attempt to escape. Now that story feels a lot more engaging because you are varying the scene formats. There's probably 4 or 5 different formats you're using there, and as a result, it does feel like there's more meaningful progress in the narrative. And then lastly, when it comes to fixing pacing on a sentence-by-sentence level, the biggest piece of advice I always tell writers with this is just change up the lengths of your sentences. So if you have a 5-word sentence, 5-word sentence, 5-word sentence, etc., starts to feel really staccato, really repetitive, and the reader will begin to go to sleep. But if you go 5-word sentence, 13-word sentence, 2-word sentence, 20-word sentence, it creates a much better sense of rhythm and flow, and the actual micro-level pacing of your story will work a lot better. And you'll notice this especially when you read your story out loud, which you should definitely be doing as part of your editing process. Number 8, forced humor. A lot of readers in the survey said that they really hate when comedy is crowbarred in a scene and it undercuts a serious emotional moment, or it just feels like it's been forced in there, but it's not very funny. And this one response probably articulates it really well. I split it up over a few lines here. Forced humor, I hate it. You can crack jokes when the time is right, but please do not break the mood of scenes for the sake of unfunny jokes. I imagine the reason behind most of these scenes is simply the result of writers too scared to make their readers upset in sad or scary scenes or whatever, but all they do with these scenes is annoy everyone. Please, writers, if you want to make an emotional scene, commit to it. Or don't even try, but do not ruin it halfway through. Yeah, this might be the thing that annoys me the most out of everything on this list. And I think a culprit here, as much as I loved a lot of the early Marvel movies, I do think that they were responsible for bringing in a lot of these kind of joking quips and a lot of using humor to undercut serious moments of emotional tension in the narrative. And I really don't enjoy that aspect of what Marvel movies have kind of created. What it really comes down to here is the difference between pathos and bathos. So pathos with a P is when you are attempting to create an emotional appeal from the reader. So you're trying to get the reader to feel something deep on an emotional level, whether it is a sense of love and connection to your character, or anger, or
because I'm with you to the end of the line.
Injustice or disgust, or whatever it is. It's trying to extract an emotion from your reader. Bathos is kind of the opposite, spelt with a B, and it's when you undercut a moment of serious emotion with a joke or with a quip. Now, sometimes you can do this really well as a way to create satire or to create genuinely funny moments of humor. And Terry Pratchett in the Discworld books is a master of using bathos like this. But quite often, bathos is just really irritating to read because you've built up this extremely great emotional moment or this sense of progression within a character, and then you just undercut it and you kind of like sucker punch the reader, and it often leaves a bad taste in their mouth. And it often is something that writers use to cop out of actually having a moment of genuine emotion, because the fear and I think the thinking behind a lot of writers when they use bathos is, oh, well, if I'm the first person to laugh at myself and to say, oh, you don't need to take this too seriously, then I don't have to be worried about the emotion falling flat and the reader doing that for me instead. It's almost like, if I call out the fact that, oh, that wasn't really that serious, then it saves me and it's a bit of a protective bubble. That's not the approach I would suggest going with in your story. I think you want to be developing the skill of being able to write genuinely impactful emotional moments. I made a whole 30-minute YouTube video on this called How to Craft Emotion in Your Fantasy Story, or How to Create Emotion in Your Fantasy Story rather. I'll link to that in the comments down below and also in the description too if you want to check that out. Number 7, shallow magic systems. So a lot of readers said they dislike magic systems that feel too simplistic or unoriginal or too ill-defined in their rule set. So we've got this comment here: badly established magic systems that leave you guessing what the exact consequences of someone using magic powers are. Another survey response: when the magic is so powerful and so reliable that the protagonist has too easy a time. That's a really good point. No limitations for magic. And then something a bit more in depth with the responses here, which I thought was quite interesting and worthy to unpack. I hate magic systems that base themselves off obscure artifacts or elder language incantations, especially with no explanation. This is still the same response continued. This sword can create fire. Why? Because it was forged in a volcano by witches? Okay. I don't know. It needs to make sense, ground itself in some sort of deeper system. Were the witches already pyromancers? Did they infuse part of their souls into the sword? Did they make a pact with some god? Did they eat some rare plant that changed their bodies? Details, facts. And I appreciate the fact that this person has put details and facts in capital letters, because I think that's one of just the best ways to improve the magic in your story, is to really drill down into the depths and the backstory behind why things are the way they are. To me, limitations and consequences are what make magic systems interesting. Magic systems that just give your characters godly powers with no drawbacks, for me personally, I don't enjoy reading about that sort of thing. And it's probably why in my own fantasy novels, I've definitely tended towards more hard magic systems with really defined rules and consequences. My first published book, Fires of the Dead, is pretty much built entirely around this magic system where you can use your blood to sort of link your soul into a fire. So it might be a campfire, it might be just a little lamplight, it might be a huge bonfire. And once you've created that connection with this fire, you can then draw energy from that fire to create your own flames. But of course, as you do that, it does reduce that fire and it will eventually extinguish it. Now, the cool thing when you have lots of defined rules and constraints for your magic system is you can then create these emergent problem-solving solutions that arise from the combination of rules you've created. So for example, in Fires of the Dead, which by the way, you can listen to the audiobook for free on Spotify. It's only about 3 hours long. It's quite a short novella that most people read in one sitting. There's a scene in this where my main character, Wisp, who is a pyromancer, is trying to ambush this camp of bandits in a forest at night. These bandits are all gathered around a campfire there. What Wisp does is he puts a bit of his blood on the tip of an arrow, shoots that arrow into their campfire, and it therefore creates a bond between him and the fire. So he's able to then suck the energy out of the fire, plunging them into the darkness so that he can begin his ambush. And another detail I really love from this magic system too, in this world, pyromancers have to bond themselves to an ancestral flame, which is sort of this huge bonfire that's kept underneath the citadel of these few noble family houses. And this fire basically houses all of the minds of the ancestors of that family. So it's kind of this group mind thing, this gestalt entity of hundreds of minds and souls in there that guides the actions of the pyromancers that draw flames from it. And also, once all of your flames that you're connected to as a pyromancer are extinguished, you die as well. When I ran my magic system contest a few months ago, I saw a ton of amazing soft magic systems that all of you guys sent in as well. You can make any magic system great. It really just comes down to development and how you use that magic system to create interesting consequences and to force your characters into difficult decisions. In many ways, the magic users are more interesting than the magic system. And a lot of times we get really caught up thinking about the intricacies of our magic system, but most writers will benefit more from really drilling down into how it impacts your characters. Number 6, miscommunication as conflict. So this was actually a bit surprising to me that something so specific came so highly in this survey I did of the readers. But we had a lot of readers say things like, they hate miscommunication, I hate when a conflict could be solved before being blown out of proportion if two people would simply talk to each other, pretty much the plot of King Lear. Overblown conflicts that can be resolved by a simple conversation between characters, conflict only happening because two characters refuse to communicate like humans, and pointless bickering over misunderstandings. I really strongly agree with this. Of course you can do it well, and as with every single thing in this video, all of these things can be done well, and you can probably think of good counterexamples to literally everything that readers say they hate here, because stories are subjective, and if you're skilled enough, you can get away with anything as an author. And also, something that one reader hates might be something that another reader loves. And next week, I'm actually doing a video about the top 10 things that fantasy readers love. That was also another question I had in this same survey. So make sure you've subscribed to the channel if you haven't already. But I really do agree with this kind of miscommunication as conflict thing. I think it is a trope that I personally find quite annoying. And I remember years ago hearing this fridge note theory of storytelling, which is if your story could be resolved by a character writing down on a post-it note an explanation of why they were behaving in the strange way they were behaving, and they put it on the fridge, and when the other character came into the house and saw that note, it would clear up the miscommunication conflicts between them, then you probably have somewhat weak sources of conflict and tension between your characters here. So think about that with your own story. Could this be solved by just like a well-written text? If so, then you may want to adjust why these characters' simple miscommunication is being blown so out of proportion. The 5th most common thing that fantasy readers hate, info dumping. So this is really probably no surprise. This is a thing that fantasy authors tend to get a bad rap for, and it's a very delicate skill to try to solve this in an elegant way in your story. But info dumping essentially refers to when you're giving excessive information to readers, usually about your world, but it can also be about your characters as well. And the problem with this is that it interrupts the flow of your narrative, and it usually isn't of too much interest to your reader. So some quotes from the survey here. I hate extraneous world building. Do I really need to know how the dwarves' economy works to understand if dwarven economics is never relevant to the story? Looking at you, Tolkien. Overly long descriptions of characters, plot, backstory, world building, etc. Lengthy exposition that is only there to explain / show off the effort of the author, especially when it is filled with needlessly complicated names of places and people that ultimately don't matter. So my thoughts on this are, it only feels like info dumping if the reader does not want to read it. The second that you make readers want to experience your info dumping, then it is no longer info dumping. It's just information that is progressing the plot or developing your characters. So your goal as a fantasy writer is to make readers want the info dump, to build up curiosity and suspense and these questions within them so that when you do finally deliver information about your world, they are eager to receive it. Now, saying this as a broader note about world building, not every fantasy story needs crazy, intricate, and in-depth world building and lore. Sometimes that stuff can just be a bit of a background element, and the focus is far more on your characters and the plot. There's really no one right way to approach your narrative, and I think sometimes in the fantasy community, we do shame writers who don't have the 1,000-year history of their world all worked out. But there's absolutely nothing wrong with that approach if you know that you're wanting to write a more character-centric story, for example. Now, of course, having said that, if world building does interest you for this story, then go ahead, make it intricate, make it developed, make it deep. But usually you're better off only conveying 10 or 20% of your world building understanding to the reader and allowing the remaining 90 or 80% to be underneath the surface, kind of like this huge iceberg where you just see the tip poking above the waters, but you know that there's all this grounding down deep underneath it. Number 4, poor character development. So as you'd probably expect, a lot of fantasy readers in the survey said that they really hate shallow characters that feel weak and flat and one-dimensional. We had this survey response saying, I hate characters who try everything and fail, yet still somehow succeed because of their great luck or because God helps them. So kind of Deus Ex Machina there. I hate generic evil groups or individuals. For example, in Harry Potter, it's clearly Gryffindor good, Slytherin bad. I prefer when the book doesn't tell me who the good and bad guys are, to let everyone have nuance and allow me to make my own judgments. I think in general, one of the strongest ways to develop the characterization in your book is to show us that groups of people or societies of people or races of people or whatever it is, they don't always have to have the exact same outlook towards things, because that's actually how real life operates as well. You can pick people from one particular group and they will have their own subtle disagreements or maybe major disagreements within that group. Another comment from the survey said they hate flat characters with no character arcs. I've got a little bit of thoughts on that. I'll get to that in a minute. And then we also had this longer response here, which is well worth reading out. When the protagonist is either a self-insert character specifically written for the reader and thus lacks any personality or motivation in comparison with the rest of the cast, or a protagonist that is so overly righteous to the point of being ridiculous, such as not offering a valid reasoning for not killing an antagonist. Yeah, I really don't like protagonists who will happily kill like 20 henchmen who probably have families and are working hard to support themselves with this, villainous job. But then they get to the main villain who has, murdered tens of thousands of people or whatever it is, and they allow them to just, live freely and then escape in the next book or whatever. Main characters who kill are great, because if they're going to kill these little side characters and these henchmen, then you really need a good reason for them to not defeat and kill the antagonist as well. So I agree with just about everything that I shared in these survey responses here, except for that note about flat characters. So flat characters, obviously there's flat in the sense that they're just like boring and they're uninteresting, but the idea of a flat character arc where a character doesn't actually change or progress is not necessarily bad. Let me explain what I mean here. So broadly speaking, with character arcs, you've got 3 options. You've got a positive arc where a character becomes better. You've got a negative character arc where a character becomes worse. So, a tragedy, for example, often does this. And then you've got a flat character arc where the character does not really get better or worse. Now, the focus in a flat character arc is not on how the character changes, but rather how they change the world around them. You take someone like Sherlock Holmes, for example, he doesn't really change much in story to story. I suppose if you're reading some adaptations, maybe that's different, but certainly in the original Arthur Conan Doyle short stories, he doesn't really change that much. The focus instead is on observing how he goes and solves this crime, and that's actually where the enjoyment comes from seeing how he impacts and processes the world around him. So flat character arcs are not necessarily bad. Saying that, I personally do prefer reading stories where a character does actually evolve either in a positive or negative sense. To me, that's just more interesting, but you can do flat character arcs fine as well. Number 3, gratuitous sex and violence. So we had a lot of readers saying that they really don't like explicit content, particularly when it comes to violence or sex in their stories. So we had readers say they don't like too much spice or smut. I don't mind when characters kiss or the light stuff, but I hate it when it goes to really inappropriate stuff. Another reader saying sex, they don't like it, graphic or otherwise, gratuitous sex and violence. I hate shock value violence, death, gore, etc. that does nothing to meaningfully enrich the story. And then another reader said they hate overly horny characters. So this again is something where it's totally subjective. There's certainly a lot of readers who just don't want to go near this stuff. And if that's your taste, like no judgment, no one should tell you what you should be reading or shouldn't be reading or whatever. Life is short, read the books you want to read, or don't. And of course, on the other side of that, there's huge swaths of the fantasy genre that are explicitly marketed for the fact that they have lots of smutty content in them. And there's lots of readers who will probably only read that stuff or only go towards those types of stories. But for me personally, I think this stuff here is a fundamental part of the human condition. And if you close yourself off from exploring it in your stories, you're really robbing yourself of an opportunity to deepen your characters and to kind of create new opportunities for conflict and growth within their lives. I do think, weirdly enough, the solution with this stuff is actually very similar to what I said for info dumping earlier. It only feels like info dumping if the reader doesn't want it. And sometimes when it comes to, gratuitous sex or violence or whatever it is, it's not that you necessarily need the reader to want this stuff, but it's that it only feels gratuitous if it doesn't make sense to your story or it doesn't feel organic or natural to your story. So I would not really approach my writing with the mindset of, hey, I'm going to include a bunch of sex and violence because I want to include that, but I would more be looking at, does this feel organic and natural and important for this plot and for these characters' stories that I need to tell? If it is, then I'm going to include it. If it isn't, then I'm not going to include it. And some fantasy books in particular that use sex in a fantastic way to develop characters and build conflict and even build the world include Blackstone Heart by Michael R. Fletcher, Jade City by Fonda Lee, and also A Little Hatred by Joe Abercrombie. What you really want to be doing is thinking about sex in the same way you think about an action scene. How does this action develop the characters and progress the plot? That's the same mindset you should be applying to sex in your stories. Number 2, poorly executed tropes. So a lot of readers said that they hate common cliches like the chosen one or medieval European settings or kind of typical black and white morality where it's very clear that there's good and bad guys. So one survey response said they hate the classic chosen one trope where the protagonist is obviously going to save the world and no matter what happens, he always wins. Let's have a little variety. Maybe the chosen one is meant to destroy the world, or he's not chosen for anything important, or he doesn't know what he's actually chosen for. Give me some original thoughts. Another survey responder said they don't want another medieval European setting, and we had a lot of people say this in the responses as well. Another thing readers hate are predictable twists and plot, generic endings for your story, and the same cliche Dungeons and Dragons deal. So I suppose using kind of typical fantasy characters and settings here. And this is one where I do agree with some of these notes, but I also push back on them a little bit. The word tropes gets a bad rap. A trope is simply an element of story. So you have your characters sitting around a campfire talking while they're traveling across a country. That's a trope. The campfire talking scene, that's a trope. You have a character discovering her magical abilities. That is a trope. It's something that we've seen a million times before. And the thing is, tropes are integral to your story. You cannot write a book without having tropes in them. So complaining about a story having tropes is a little bit like complaining that your trees have wood. You just can't build a story without these things. But of course, if you execute a trope badly and you pick a trope that has been done a lot of times before and you don't bring anything original or fresh to it, then yes, it will feel like a cliche and it probably will alienate your reader. But what defines a cliche is when something is done in an unoriginal, uninspiring, and bland way. Whenever I'm talking to writers about this, such as in my fantasy outlining bootcamp that I'm running at the moment, I always talk about this in terms of degrees of difficulty. So some tropes are going to have a low degree of difficulty because we just haven't seen them much as a reader before. They feel quote unquote original. And so therefore it's kind of easy to step over that bar. There's other tropes where because the reader has probably seen them done a billion times before, there is maybe a higher degree of difficulty because you're comparing your approach in your story to like 20 other stories that they've read before with similar elements. But it doesn't mean you can't still clear that bar. And it's worth noting too that readers come to your story for the tropes. There's readers who love stories about found families. That is a trope. There's readers who love morally grey characters. That is also a trope. And these different tropes are the things that you're using to get readers in the door. You're communicating them through your cover, through your title, through your blurb, sometimes even through, the first few chapters of your book as well. And so they're the things that you get readers to come in with, and hopefully through your exploration of them, you can then add your own twist and you can introduce readers to other things that they didn't realize they were coming to the story to in the first place. I really think it's key to actually lean into the tropes you enjoy the most. And I made a video on this channel talking about 7 fantasy tropes that work every time, i.e. they're just the ones that work every time for me. They're 7 of my particular favorite tropes. For example, Kingdom of Dragons, my latest book, has a magical school, a floating city, and dragon riders, which are all common tropes you've probably read about before. But hopefully through my own experience of, having been an architect in the past, I can use that to create a floating city that is more well thought out than maybe most other floating cities out there. And through my own exploration of the dragons, hopefully there's a sense of freshness and originality and my unique creative vision that will impart a certain different spin on these tropes as you read them. And I think that when you write about things that you love and you bring your excitement and your curiosity, that really creates a genuine sense of freshness that conveys over to the reader and stops the tropes feeling cliched and instead just makes them feel really enjoyable to read. And hopefully when you read Kingdom of Dragons, you'll find a lot of that excitement and that freshness in these aforementioned tropes as well. And this brings us to the number one thing that fantasy readers hate based on my survey of about 350 people or so, which is forced romances. So readers really hated the idea of romances that feel forced or unnatural or just lacking a bit of spark between the characters. So we had some readers just straight up say that they just don't like romances in their stories, which, you probably expect there's some readers who are not interested in that. There's another response here saying, I hate unnecessary romance or smut that doesn't contribute to the storyline. Another reader complaining about love triangles because they're rarely done well. The main complaint they had here is that often it's very clear who is going to pick who in the love triangle. But their comment here, which was good, is that you should try to have two equally compelling choices for your love pyramid. Don't make it too obvious. Another reader said they hated romance with no chemistry. And another reader said they hate love triangles or insta-love. It's cringy. I actually think the insta-love one is a fair point here. Of course, as with all these things, can be done really well. So my thoughts on this, similar to the point about how readers hate sex and violence, or at least some readers hate that stuff. It's the kind of thing where, there are some readers who just won't touch romance, and then there's other readers who romance is the most interesting aspect of a story for them. And it's worth noting that romance is the most popular and best-selling genre of fiction out of all the genres. I think it goes romance, then it goes kind of like crime, mystery, thriller, and then fantasy, surprisingly, which is good news for us, is in third place and has actually been rising a lot in popularity in recent years, thanks to all the TV and movie adaptations of varying qualities, I suppose. But of course, writing a great romance has a really high degree of difficulty. And there can be a weird stigma we feel sometimes as writers about describing our book as a romance to someone else. I was chatting with one of the writers in my bootcamp about this the other week, about how she felt hesitant to describe her book as a romance because, yes, there's romantic elements in it, but it's about so much more to it as well. And I think there's just a real fear that a lot of us writers have about our books being dismissed as a stupid romance. And it actually reminds me a little bit of that scene in The Princess Bride, which I saw with a live orchestra the other day. It was an incredible experience. There's a scene in that movie where the young kid, as his grandpa's reading this book to him, the kid asks,
"Is this a kissing book?"
But then over the course of the story, he actually warms to the idea of these characters falling in love with each other, and he asks if they're going to kiss towards the end. And again, I think romance is an important aspect of the human condition, and so it's important to explore in your stories if you feel compelled to. A well-executed romance is just one of the great pleasures of reading because it offers you an opportunity for connection and vulnerability and growth between two characters that is really hard to get in a lot of other ways. Perhaps the best way of saying this is that a great romance is going to make your story amazing, and a crappy romance is going to make your story really suck. It's almost this amplifier that either creates an awesome outcome or a bad outcome, but it keeps your story from being in that sort of boring middle zone. It's something with high risk and high reward. For me personally, I've had romantic elements in quite a few of my fantasy novels, although it's only really with my video game Siege of Treblan, where there are romantic options you can have with some of the non-player characters, and then it's only really with Kingdom of Dragons that I brought the romance to the forefront. And part of that was because I felt like I really needed to develop as a writer before I had the skill to pull off a good romance in my stories. And also, some of the other stories I've written in the past, the romance just wasn't really that organic or that important to the plot here. But with Kingdom of Dragons, it's a major source of tension and narrative drive throughout the whole story, so it became a really important element, and based on the feedback I've had from my early readers, it seemed to work really well in the final story. If you enjoyed this video and you want more fantasy writing tutorials, you might want to check out this playlist over here where I cover the most common mistakes I see new fantasy writers making all the time based on my experience of having written 4 fantasy novels and having edited dozens of fantasy novels as well over the years. I cover character mistakes, description mistakes, plot mistakes, and a whole lot more.